The photograph had been on the wall for 20 years. Chester Brackett had hung it himself on the morning he moved into the office that people in eastern Iowa had started calling the nicest construction headquarters between Des Moines and the Mississippi. He had driven the nail with 3 strikes, hung the frame level on the first try, stepped back, and looked at it for exactly as long as it took him to decide it was straight. Then he had gone back to work. The photograph showed a young man of 25 standing beside a rented backhoe on a dirt lot outside Dubuque. The young man was lean and serious, squinting against the morning sun, wearing a work shirt that had been washed so many times it had lost its original color. He had one hand resting on the machine, the way you rest your hand on the shoulder of someone you are not quite sure you can trust. Everything he owned at that moment could fit in the bed of the pickup truck parked behind him. The machine was not his. The lot was not his. The only thing in the frame that belonged to him was the expression on his face, which was the expression of a man who had decided something and was not going to undecide it. Chester kept the photograph where he could see it from his desk. Not for sentiment. He was not a sentimental man. He kept it because it was a useful reminder that he had started with nothing and built something real, and that the distance between those 2 points had been crossed by making good decisions and not flinching when other men would have. The photograph was evidence. It said you had been tested before and you did not fail. On the morning of Tuesday, September 8th, 1992, Chester Brackett stood at the window of that office and looked out at the parking lot where his trucks had in rows 18 of them, each one lettered with the name Brackett Construction in clean blue paint. His company employed 150 men. He had equipment worth more than most banks in Clayton County would lend to a single borrower. He had just signed the largest contract in the history of the county, the construction of a 12-mile stretch of Highway 52 that would run north through farmland that had been sleeping under corn and soybeans since before any living person could remember. The telephone on his desk rang at 7:43 in the morning. He let it ring twice because he always let it ring twice. Then he picked it up and heard the voice of Rupert Radford, who had been his chief engineer for 12 years, and who had never in those 12 years called before 8 in the morning unless something had gone wrong in a way that could not wait. Rupert said, "Chester, we lost the 375. Chester did not say anything for 3 seconds. He stood at the window and looked at the parking lot and the trucks in their rows, and he felt something move through his chest that was not quite fear and not quite anger, but was the beginning of understanding that a day he had not planned for had just begun. The Caterpillar 375 was the newest machine in his fleet. He had purchased it 4 months earlier for $600,000 more than he had paid for his first house and his second house combined. It was the largest hydraulic excavator on the market, a machine of such size and precision that the dealer had brought a trainer from the factory to spend 3 days teaching Chester's operators how to use it properly. When the machine arrived on the Highway 52 project site, Chester had stood beside it and felt the particular satisfaction of a man who has come a long way from a rented backhoe on a dirt lot. The 375 was not just equipment, it was a statement. It told every contractor and county official and competing firm in eastern Iowa exactly what kind of company Brackett Construction had become. Now it was in a swamp. Chester drove to the site without speaking to anyone in the office. He drove the way he drove when something was wrong. Both hands on the wheel, eyes on the road, already working through the problem before he arrived at it. The morning was warm and clear, the sky the particular shade of blue that September produces in Iowa, and the corn along the county road stood at its full summer height, the stalks thick and dry and waiting for harvest. It was a beautiful morning. Chester did not notice. He came over a low rise and saw the swamp before he saw the machine. The swamp was not large, perhaps 2 acres of standing water and black mud and dead cattails at the northern edge of the construction corridor. The surveyors had marked it. The preliminary soil report had addressed it. Chester had read the report in April and accepted its conclusions, which were that the area was manageable and that the surface crust was sufficient to support equipment traffic during the dry summer months. The Caterpillar 375 had broken through that surface crust at 11 minutes past 3 the previous afternoon. What Chester saw when he reached the edge of the swamp was this 60 tons of yellow steel and hydraulic precision buried to the cab in black mud, the operator's cab rising from the surface at a slight angle, the boom extended and hanging in the air at the particular posture of something that has been caught mid-motion and frozen there. The machine's tracks were completely invisible beneath the surface. The mud around it was dark and smooth and undisturbed, as if the swamp had simply accepted the machine and closed over it without effort. Rupert Radford was standing at the edge of solid ground with a clipboard and an expression that Chester had learned to read over 12 years of working together. It was the expression Rupert wore when he had already assessed the situation thoroughly and had arrived at conclusions he did not want to deliver. "Peters," Chester said. "Yes?" "How long had he been running the 375? 12 years with us. He's run equipment heavier than that on sites with worse paper ratings." "Where is he now?" "I sent him home. He's not injured. He's shaken up." Chester looked at the machine for a long time without speaking. Then he said, "What do we have on site that can pull it out?" Rupert told him. 2 Caterpillar D8 bulldozers, both rated for work in difficult terrain, both capable of generating more raw pulling force than anything else currently available at the site. Chester told him to use them both. Rupert made a call on the radio. By 9 that morning, both bulldozers were chained to the 375, the chains running taut across the surface of the mud, and both operators had their machines at full throttle. Chester stood and watched. The chains went rigid. The bulldozer engines howled. One operator pushed his machine to the edge of its rated capacity and then passed it, and for 40 seconds, nothing happened except noise and exhaust and the slow, terrible grinding of steel against the limits of what it could do. Then one of the chains snapped. The sound was a single sharp crack like a rifle shot, and the broken end of the chain whipped across the surface of the mud and buried itself 6 inches deep in the soft earth at the edge of the swamp. Chester flinched. He had been in construction for 20 years, and he had heard equipment fail before, but something about the sound of that chain, the absolute finality of it, stayed with him for the rest of the day. The Caterpillar 375 had not moved an inch. Worse than that, he realized looking at the tracks of the 2 bulldozers pressed into the ground, was that the machines had been pulling toward the swamp as much as pulling away from it. The 375 was not simply heavy. Something beneath the surface was holding it. The mud was not loose. It was a trap, and it was patient, and it had been waiting there under a thin, dry crust since before Chester Beckett was born. He stood at the edge of the swamp for a while after the bulldozers were unchained and moved back to solid ground. The September sun was climbing, and the day was becoming hot. From somewhere in the distance, a crow was calling, and a tractor was running in a field he could not see, and the world was continuing to move at its ordinary pace around a problem that had stopped Chester Beckett completely. He drove home that evening at 9 o'clock and found his wife Catherine at the kitchen table with a mug of cold coffee and a stack of tests from her algebra class ungraded. She taught at the high school in town. She had been teaching there for 16 years, and Chester had noticed over those years that she brought work home, not because she had to, but because the act of grading student work was something she could control completely, a fixed and reliable task in a world of things that refused to stay fixed. She looked up when he came in and read his face the way she had learned to read it over 20 years of marriage. "Tell me," she said. He told her. The machine, the swamp, the chains. He told her the numbers because she was a woman who thought in numbers, and he had always respected that about her. $600,000 in equipment, $20,000 a day in project delays, a $50,000 penalty clause if the Highway 52 project missed its November deadline. And beyond those numbers, the possibility, the still distant but real possibility, that the Highway 380 contract he had been negotiating for 3 months might be affected if this story became public in the wrong way. Catherine listened without interrupting. When he finished, she set down her red marking pen and looked at him directly. "Before the machine went in," she said, "did anyone talk to the people who lived near that stretch of ground?" Chester said that the survey team had conducted thorough soil assessments and that all findings had been documented and reviewed. Catherine was quiet for a moment. She had a particular quality of silence that Chester had learned to pay attention to, a silence that meant she was deciding how directly to say what she intended to say. "Chester," she said, "did anyone talk to the people who lived near that stretch of ground?" He heard the question differently the second time. Not the survey team, not the professionals with their instruments and their certified reports. The people who lived there, the farmers and the longtime residents who had been walking that ground for decades and who knew things that no instrument could measure because the knowledge was in their feet and their bones and the accumulated memory of watching a particular piece of earth behave across many years and many seasons. "No," he said, "not that I know of." Catherine picked up her marking pen and returned to the tests. "Get some sleep," she said. "You'll think better in the morning." He went to bed at 10. He did not sleep well. At some point in the early hours of the morning, he got up and went to the kitchen for water, and he saw the construction survey report sitting on the table where Catherine had left it. He had not left it there. He had not brought it home. He recognized it as the copy that Rupert Radford kept in his project files, and he understood that Catherine had asked Rupert for it or that Rupert had sent it to her and that she had been reading it while he slept. He picked it up and turned to the back page. In the lower corner, in handwriting that was not the survey team's standard notation, but something added separately in blue ink, were these words: "North Corridor, Sector 7 through 9, recommend local consultation regarding summer dry season surface conditions before heavy equipment deployment." Below those words, a blank line where a check mark or initials should have appeared. No check mark, no initials, no record of any consultation having taken place. Chester stood in his kitchen at 3 in the morning and read those words 3 times. Then he put the report back on the table exactly where he had found it and went back to bed. He lay in the dark and looked at the ceiling and did not sleep until almost 5. The second day brought a recovery company from Des Moines, specialists in heavy equipment extraction who had been in business for 15 years and who had, by their own accounting, extracted machinery from situations that their competitors had declared impossible. They arrived with a 50-ton winch mounted on a heavy truck and a crew of 4 men who moved with the efficiency of people who had done difficult work many times and had learned not to waste motion on things that did not matter. They assessed the situation for an hour. They sank a concrete anchor into solid ground half a mile from the swamp, running their steel cable in a long diagonal across the construction corridor. They set their winch to pull at 30% of rated capacity and increase the load in careful increments, watching their instruments communicating by radio with the anchor crew. When the cable reached its working tension, something happened that Chester had not anticipated. The cable stretched. He had not known that steel cable stretched, but it did, the individual strands taking load at slightly different rates, the whole assembly elongating by a fraction of its length under tension. The winch screamed, the anchor groaned. The surface of the mud around the 375 did not move. The recovery team's foreman, a thick-shouldered man named Bill, who had been doing this work since before Chester had started his company, walked over and stood beside Chester at the edge of the swamp. "The problem isn't lateral force," Bill said. He was not apologizing. He was explaining, and Chester had the sense that he was explaining because he respected precision and wanted the diagnosis to be accurate, not because he needed Chester to feel better about what was happening. "There's negative pressure under that machine. The mud got in around the tracks when it broke through, and now it's sealed. You're not fighting the weight of the machine, you're fighting suction." "How much suction?" Bill considered the question. "Enough that the cable will fail before the seal breaks. I've seen it before. You need vertical lift, or you need to break the seal from below before you try lateral extraction. Or you need something heavy enough and slow enough that it can sustain continuous load without creating shock stress. Shock stress is what breaks cables. Steady pull might work if you can sustain it long enough." The cable broke 40 minutes later. The anchor pulled free of the ground. The 375 sank another 6 inches. Bill's crew packed their equipment without comment. Chester signed their invoice and stood at the edge of the swamp until the sound of their truck faded down the county road. The afternoon was still and hot, and the 375 sat in the mud with the patience of something that had accepted its situation and was simply waiting to see what came next. That evening, Chester did not go home at 9. He sat in his truck at the edge of the site until nearly midnight thinking. He had built a career on the principle that every problem had a solution if you brought enough intelligence and enough resources to bear on it. He had believed this completely and had been proven right enough times that the belief had become something closer to certainty. He had begun to think of problem solving not as a skill, but as a natural law, one that applied consistently across all situations if you applied yourself with sufficient discipline. The swamp was not cooperating with this understanding. He drove home and slept badly for the 3rd night in a row. 300 yards north of the construction corridor, behind the row of oaks that the survey team had used as their reference boundary, Harlan Osborne had been watching every one of these attempts from the edge of his fence line. He was 73 years old and had farmed the same 400 acres for 50 years. And he knew the North Corridor the way a man knows his own face, not by studying it, but by living with it across so many seasons that its moods and surprises had become familiar. He had known about the swamp since he was a boy. His father had told him about it, and his grandfather had told his father, and the knowledge had passed down not as a formal warning, but as a piece of ordinary understanding, the kind of thing you simply knew if you had been paying attention to a particular piece of ground for long enough. When Breckett Construction's survey crew came through in the spring, Harlan had talked to the young man with the clipboard for about 10 minutes. He had explained the underground spring that fed the swamp from the northwest and the way that a dry summer would build a surface crust that looked solid from above and was not, and the fact that the worst area was in the exact corridor the young man had just marked for heavy equipment access. The young man had listened politely and written things in his notebook and thanked Harlan for his time. Harlan had watched him drive away and had known in the way you know certain things without being able to explain why, that what he had said would not reach the person who needed to hear it. He was not bitter about this. It had happened before. People who worked from blueprints and soil reports found it difficult to weight the testimony of a man who worked from memory and attention. He understood the difficulty, he just did not share it. So he had watched. Day 1, the bulldozers. Day 2, the winch and the cable. Day 3, the crane that turned around before it got close. 3 days of watching capable men with expensive equipment fail to understand what the ground was telling them. 3 days of waiting for the moment when they would have run out of everything else and might possibly be ready to try something different. The third morning after the crane left, he went inside and put on his work clothes. The third day, he arranged for a crane. The company he called was out of Cedar Rapids, a reputable firm he had worked with on bridge projects, and they dispatched their largest machine with an operator named Terry, who had 20 years of experience and who arrived at the site at 8 in the morning and walked the perimeter of the swamp before he said anything at all. Terry stood at what Chester estimated was about 100 feet from the edge of the swamp. He stopped walking there and did not go closer. He looked at the 375. He looked at the ground between where he was standing and the machine. He looked at the sky, which was clear and blue, as if checking conditions that had nothing to do with the weather. "I'm not getting within 100 feet of that edge," Terry said. "I'll pay a risk premium," Chester said. "It's not about the money. If that ground doesn't hold me, you've got 2 machines in the swamp instead of 1. The second one won't come out any easier than the first." Terry looked at the 375 one more time with the expression of a professional who is accustomed to distinguishing between difficult situations and impossible ones, and who has decided which category this belongs to. "I'm sorry, I can't help you." The crane left at 9:15 in the morning. Chester stood at the edge of the project site with Rupert Radford and 3 of his engineers, and he looked at a list that Rupert had prepared on his clipboard, a list of remaining options with cost estimates and time assessments beside each one. A sky crane from Minnesota, $15,000 an hour plus mobilization, 18 hours to arrive. Pumping the swamp dry, 1 month minimum, infrastructure not available. Partial disassembly of the 375 in place, which would render the machine effectively destroyed. Chester looked at the list for a long time. Then he looked at the 375, which had sunk perceptibly since the previous morning, its cab now only 18 inches above the surface of the mud. "Rupert," he said, "is there anything on that list you haven't told me about?" Rupert held the clipboard against his chest for a moment. It was a small gesture, barely noticeable, but Chester had worked with this man for 12 years, and he recognized it as the gesture Rupert made when he was deciding whether to say something he had been holding back. "There's a neighbor," Rupert said, "north side of the corridor, Harlan Osborne. He farms the 400 acres behind that tree line." Rupert nodded toward the row of old oaks that marked the northern boundary of the construction corridor. "I asked around. Bill Kowalski over at the county agricultural office told me Osborne's been farming that land for 50 years. Knows this whole stretch of ground better than anyone." Rupert paused. "He also said Osborne has something in his equipment shed, a machine." "What kind of machine?" Rupert said, "A steam traction engine, case model from 1912. The engineers were quiet. Chester looked at Rupert with an expression that did not change. "From 1912, Chester said. "Yes. Someone suggested we try a steam engine from 1912 to pull out a 60-ton excavator. Bill Kowalski said that if anything could pull steady load through this kind of ground without creating the shock stress that breaks cables, it would be a large diameter steel wheel with low rotational speed and high torque. He said the old steamers were built for exactly that kind of work." Rupert held Chester's eyes. "I'm telling you what he told me." Chester looked at the tree line. Behind it somewhere was a man named Harlan Osborne, who had been farming this particular piece of Iowa earth for 50 years, who knew the North Corridor and its dry season surface conditions from decades of direct experience, and who had possibly tried to share that knowledge with someone on Chester's project team 6 months earlier and had been thanked politely and not listened to. What Chester did not know, and what Rupert did not know, because nobody had thought to ask, was that the Osborne family had been connected to that particular piece of ground since before Chester's own father was born. Harlan's grandfather, Wendell Osborne, had broken the first sod on the family's 400 acres in 1898 and had spent the first decade of the new century converting raw prairie into farmland with the tools and animals available to him. In 1912, when a manufacturer in Racine, Wisconsin, was selling a steam traction engine for $3,200, Wendell had saved and borrowed through the better part of a year to make the purchase because he understood that the engine would allow him to do in a day what teams of horses required a week to accomplish. Wendell used the case for 20 harvests, hiring out the machine and his labor to neighbors across Clayton County, doing the heavy work that no other tool could accomplish as reliably. When gasoline tractors became common in the late 20s and 30s, nearly every farmer in the county sold their steam equipment for scrap. Wendell did not. He parked the case in the shed, covered it with canvas, and told his son they might need it again someday. His son thought this was sentiment. It took 2 more generations to find out he was right. "Find out if he'll come talk to us," Chester said. What Chester did not know, and what Rupert did not know because nobody had thought to ask, was that Harlan Osborne's family had been connected to that particular piece of ground for longer than Breckett Construction had existed. Harlan's grandfather, Wendell Osborne, had broken the first sod on the family's 400 acres in 1898 and had spent the first decade of the new century converting raw prairie into farmland with the tools and animals available to him then. In 1912, when a manufacturer in Racine, Wisconsin was selling a steam traction engine for $3,200, Wendell had spent the better part of a year saving and borrowing to make the purchase because he understood that the engine would allow him to do in a day what teams of horses required a week to accomplish. Wendell Osborne used the case for 20 harvests. He used it to pull threshing equipment from farm to farm across Clayton County, hiring out his machine and his knowledge to neighbors who needed the work done but could not afford their own steam power. He used it to drag stumps from fields he was expanding, to pull wagons out of the spring mud, to do the kinds of work that were not dramatic but were necessary and that no other tool could accomplish as reliably. When gasoline tractors became common in the late 1920s and 30s, nearly every farmer in the county sold their steam equipment for scrap. The old machines were slow to start and expensive to fuel, and required a level of attention that seemed unnecessary when a gasoline tractor could be started in minutes and ran without a fire. Wendell did not sell the case. He parked it in the shed, covered it with canvas, and told his son that they might need it again someday. His son thought this was sentiment. His son was wrong, but he did not find out in his own lifetime. It was Harlan, the grandson, who found out. He did not know, standing there at the edge of the swamp on the morning of the 3rd day, that Harlan Osborne had already decided to come. He did not know that the old farmer had been watching from behind his fence line for 3 days, watching every attempt fail, waiting with the patience of a man who had spent 50 years learning that the right moment to speak was not the first moment you had something to say. He did not know any of that. What he knew was that his best machine was sinking by inches into black Iowa mud, and that his engineers had run out of answers, and that somewhere behind a row of oak trees, a man he had never met owned something from 1912 that might or might not be the last option left. Rupert was still watching him. The engineers were waiting. Chester turned and looked at the 375 one more time. The September sun was climbing. The mud around the machine was still and dark and patient. "All right," he said. "Let's see what the man has." He did not say it with confidence. He did not say it with hope exactly. He said it the way a man says something when he has exhausted every other thing he knows how to say, when the situation has stripped away his certainty and his expertise and his 20 years of being the person with the answers, and what is left is something simpler and older, the plain willingness to try the next thing. Behind the tree line, a shed door was already open. The canvas had already been pulled back, and in the darkness of that shed, something enormous and iron and 80 years old was waiting, with the same patience it had always had, the patience of a machine that does not know what it cannot do. The morning moved on. The mud held the 375 in its grip, and 3 miles down the county road, a man named Harlan Osborne was reading the pressure gauge on a boiler that had last been fired 6 weeks earlier at the Clayton County Steam and Gas Show, checking each fitting with the particular care of someone who understands that thoroughness is not caution but respect, preparing to do what he had known for 3 days he would eventually be asked to do. He was not hurrying. He had never seen the value in hurrying. The machine would be ready when it was ready, and when it was ready, it would do what it had always done. That was enough. It had always been enough. They heard it before they saw it. 2 hours before that sound reached the construction site, Leland Osborne had been standing in the equipment shed watching his father build a fire in the boiler of a machine that had been in their family for 80 years. Leland was 38, the same age his father had been when he first began seriously learning the case, and he had watched this process so many times over his life that he knew every step of it by heart. He knew the order in which the valves were opened and the sequence in which the pressure gauges were checked. He knew the specific sound that meant the water temperature had reached the point where steam would begin to form in earnest, a low, grumbling note from somewhere deep in the iron body of the machine, different from all the other sounds it made, unmistakable once you had heard it a few dozen times. What he was watching this morning, though, was not simply the startup procedure. He was watching his father's face. Harlan Osborne was not a man who showed much on his face in ordinary circumstances. 50 years of farming in Iowa weather had organized his features into an arrangement that was pleasant without being expressive, the face of someone who has spent a long time working outdoors and has made a private accommodation with whatever the day brings. But this morning, standing at the boiler with the fire beginning to take hold and the pressure gauge sitting at 0 and the work ahead of him clear and specific and within his abilities, Harlan Osborne's face had something in it that Leland had seen only a handful of times. It was not excitement. It was not satisfaction, not yet. It was something quieter than either of those, a kind of settled readiness, the look of a man who has been waiting for a particular task for a very long time and is now simply present at the beginning of it. Leland had brought a camera. He had tucked it into his jacket pocket that morning without deciding to the way you do things that seem right before you have thought them through. He was not sure what he expected to photograph. He was not primarily a person who thought in images, but something about the morning, the shed with the canvas pulled back and the machine standing in the October light, and his father's particular stillness as he worked told him that he would want a record of this. He took one photograph while his father's back was turned. The frame showed the boiler and the stack, and Harlan's hands on the valve housing, and the pressure gauge in the background, still reading 0, everything waiting, nothing yet committed. He did not show his father the camera. Harlan would have said it was unnecessary. He would have been right in his way and wrong in a way he could not see. The sound came from the direction of the tree line from somewhere beyond the old oaks that marked the northern boundary of the project corridor, and it was not a sound that belonged to the morning. It was low and rhythmic, and it moved through the ground before it moved through the air, a deep percussive pulse that Chester Beckett felt in the soles of his boots before his ears fully registered what it was. The engineers on the site stopped what they were doing. The two bulldozer operators, who had been sitting on their machines eating lunch from paper bags, looked up and looked north. Rupert Radford lowered his clipboard. Then the whistle came. A single long cry of steam rising and holding, and then cutting off cleanly, and it crossed the flat September farmland like something that had been waiting a long time for permission to speak. Chester had never heard a sound quite like it. It was not mechanical, or rather, it was mechanical in the way that a church bell is mechanical, something made of metal and physics, that had nonetheless become something else through long use and accumulated meaning. He looked at Rupert. Rupert was already looking north. The Case steam traction engine came over the low-rise at the edge of Harlan Osborne's property at 5 miles an hour, and every person on that construction site stopped moving. Chester had tried to picture it after Rupert mentioned it the previous morning. He had imagined something along the lines of a large antique tractor, the kind that showed up at county fairs in glass cases or roped off from the public. He had imagined something museum-worthy, which meant something fragile and preserved, and past its usefulness, an artifact that existed to be looked at rather than to do work. He had not imagined this. The machine was enormous in a way that photographs could not have prepared him for, enormous in the way that certain things are enormous only when you are standing near them, and your body registers their scale against its own. The rear drive wheels stood 6 feet tall and were studded with curved steel cleats, each one the size of a man's forearm. The boiler ran the length of the machine and had been painted black and polished until it caught the morning light. The brass fittings on the valves and gauges burned gold in the September sun. Black smoke rose from the stack in a column that bent slightly south in the light breeze. Steam vented from a side valve in a long white exhale that drifted and vanished. The man driving it sat on an iron platform at the rear of the machine with both hands on the controls, a man of 73 years in worn work clothes, unhurried, watching the path ahead with the same expression he might have worn driving a pickup truck down a road he had driven 10,000 times. One of the engineers said something under his breath. Chester did not hear the words, but heard the tone, which was the tone of a man revising an assumption he had held with confidence. Harlan Osborne brought the machine down the slope toward the construction site at the same measured pace, steering around the worst of the ruts in the access road, and then he pulled to a stop at the edge of the solid ground, roughly 200 feet from the swamp's edge, and set the brake. The machine settled into stillness, with a long hiss of released pressure. The drive wheels stopped turning. Harlan climbed down from the platform. He was not a tall man, but he moved with the economy of someone who had spent decades doing physical work and had learned that wasted motion was a form of expenditure he could not afford. He went to the rear of the machine and began uncoiling a chain that had been wrapped around a steel bracket there. Chester walked toward him. Rupert fell into step alongside. "Chester," he said quietly, "I want to say something before you talk to him." "Say it." "I should have brought the survey footnote to you in April. I made a decision that it wasn't significant enough to escalate, and I was wrong. I'm telling you that now because I think you should hear it from me before anything else happens today." Chester did not stop walking. He absorbed what Rupert had said, and he held it without responding because he recognized that a response was not what the moment required. What the moment required was acknowledgement, and he gave it in the only way available to him at that second, which was a slight shift in his pace, a fraction slower, that told Rupert he had heard. They reached Harlan Osborne as he was lifting the first length of chain from the bracket. The chain was something Chester had not seen outside of maritime salvage footage. Each link forged steel as thick as a man's wrist. The whole assembly moving with a weight and gravity that made the snapped chain from the first morning look like something decorative. "Mr. Osborne," Chester said. Harlan looked up. "Mr. Breckett, that chain won't hold," one of the engineers said. He said it not unkindly, but with the reflexive authority of someone who has spent his career calculating load ratings. "We snapped a cable rated at 50 tons. Harlan set one end of the chain on the ground and looked at the engineer without expression. This one is rated at 80, and cable snaps because it doesn't give. Chain gives a little before it goes. Gives me time to read what's happening and back off the load. He returned to uncoiling. Different tools for different problems. The engineer started to say something further and then did not. Chester watched him decide not to, and he understood the decision because Harlan had said it with such complete absence of defensiveness that there was nothing to push back against. Chester looked at the machine. Up close, the details of it resolved into something he had not expected. Not the deterioration of age, but the opposite, the evidence of sustained and devoted attention. The paint was recent. The brass fittings had been polished by hand. The wooden handle of a valve near the boiler face had been replaced at some point with new oak, fitted, precisely sanded smooth. This was not a machine that had merely survived. It was a machine that someone had spent years bringing back. "How long have you had it?" Chester asked. 80 years in the family. My grandfather bought it new." Harlan picked up the chain and began walking toward the swamp's edge, the lynx trailing behind him across the ground. "He used it for 20 years, then it sat for 30, then I spent 3 years putting it back together." "Why?" Harlan stopped walking for a moment and looked back. It was the first time he had looked at Chester with anything approaching directness. Not hostility, not warmth, simply the level attention of a man deciding how much of an honest answer the question deserved. "Because my grandfather said, 'Don't let them take it away,'" Harlan said, "and because I believed him." He turned and kept walking toward the swamp. Chester watched him go. Harlan Osborne walked into the mud without ceremony, the chain over one shoulder, his boots disappearing into the surface with each step, the dark mud accepting his weight and then releasing it as he moved forward. By the time he reached the 375, the mud was at his chest. He worked around the front of the machine, found the frame connection point he had identified from the shore, and hooked the chain with movements that were practiced and deliberate. He tested the connection twice by pulling against it with his full weight. Then he turned and walked back. He came out of the swamp covered in black mud from the chest down. He did not appear to notice. Chester saw something in that indifference that stayed with him. It was not performance. It was not toughness being demonstrated for an audience. It was simply the behavior of a man for whom mud was a material condition of work, no more remarkable than rain or wind, something that happened and was dealt with and then cleaned off. Harlan climbed back up onto the machine's platform and checked his pressure gauge. His hands moved across the controls with the fluency of long familiarity, touching each point in sequence, reading what each told him. "One question," Chester said. He was standing at the edge of the solid ground looking up at the old man on the iron platform. "I need to understand why this will work when nothing else has." Harlan looked down at him for a moment. Then he said the thing that Chester would repeat in various forms for the rest of his life. "Your machines are designed to protect themselves," Harlan said. "When the load gets too high, they back off. That's good engineering, but it means there's a ceiling on what they'll do." He settled his hand on the throttle. "This machine doesn't have that ceiling. The only ceiling is me, and I know where the line is." He opened the throttle. The sound the case made when it engaged was not the sound of starting. It had been running since before it reached the site. This was the sound of a machine accepting a load, the deep, rhythmic, pulse-changing character, as the drivetrain took up the tension of the chain, the pistons moving with greater deliberateness, the whole mechanism shifting into the register of serious work. The drive wheels turned. Each steel cleat descended to the earth and found it and stayed there, rotating down and back, driving the machine forward with a force that was not spectacular, but was constant and complete, and showed no interest in stopping. The chain went taut. It went taut in a way that was different from the cable, different from the chains that had connected the bulldozers to the 375 on the first morning. It went taut slowly, taking up tension in increments, each link engaging in sequence, and it stayed taut without vibrating because the load was being applied at a rate that the steel could accept without complaint. In the cab of the 375 something moved. It was barely visible from shore, a slight shift in the angle of the boom, a tremor in the machine's posture. But Chester saw it, and Rupert saw it, and the two bulldozer operators who had failed to move that machine 2 days earlier saw it, and none of them said anything because saying something felt like a risk, like a sound that might interrupt whatever was happening. The case kept pulling. The drive wheels kept turning. One cleat at a time, one rotation at a time, with the patience of something that had been built for exactly this. The 375 moved. Not far, not yet. An inch, perhaps two, a shift so small that it might have been imagined, except that Chester had been watching that machine for 3 days, and he knew its position precisely, and what he was seeing was real. The machine had moved towards solid ground. For the first time in 72 hours, it had moved in the right direction. Then the mud released it. The sound was not what Chester expected. He had expected a dramatic tearing noise, something that matched the scale of what was happening. Instead, there was a long, low liquid exhalation, a deep sucking sound that built over several seconds and then resolved into something almost organic, the sound of the earth giving up something it had been holding. The 375 came out of the swamp in stages first. The forward section of the tracks appearing at the surface, streaming black mud, then more of the undercarriage, and then the machine was moving, actually moving across the surface of the mud toward solid ground. 5 feet, 10. The crowd of workers that had gathered without Chester noticing was making noise now, the inarticulate sound of people who have been watching something impossible and have just seen it become possible. 20 feet. The 375 was on firmer ground, its tracks biting into the transition zone between swamp edge and solid earth, and it kept coming, the chain still taut, the case still pulling, as if Harlan Osborne had decided that almost out was not the same as out. 30 feet, 40. Harlan brought the machine to a stop with the 375 fully on solid ground, another 60 feet of clearance between it and the swamp's edge. He closed the throttle. The case settled. Then he reached for the whistle valve and pulled it once, a single short cry of steam, and the sound went out across the flat Iowa farmland and disappeared into the distance. The workers erupted. Chester did not erupt. He stood absolutely still and watched Harlan Osborne climb down from the platform with the same unhurried competence he had used to climb up, and he felt something moving through him that he did not immediately have a name for. It was not simple relief, although relief was part of it. It was not gratitude, although that was there too. It was something more complicated, something that had to do with 20 years of being the person who solved problems and what it felt like to watch a problem be solved by someone else, with something he had laughed at using knowledge he had not asked for. Rupert came to stand beside him. Neither of them spoke for a moment. The workers were still celebrating in the background, the noise of it washing across the field like something physical. And the 375 sat on solid ground dripping mud, and the case stood with its drive wheels still, and its boiler ticking as it began to cool, and Chester Beckett stood between these two machines and understood that what had just happened was not a problem being solved. It was something older than that, something that had to do with what knowledge was and where it lived and how long it could survive without being used. He thought about the photograph on his office wall, the young man with his hand on the rented backhoe. He had always understood that image as evidence of how far he had come. Standing here, he understood for the first time that it was also evidence of what he had left behind, the particular openness of a man who knows he does not know everything, who is still watching, still learning, still willing to be surprised. Somewhere in the 20 years between that photograph and this swamp, he had stopped being that man and had started being something more rigid and less capable, a man who had confused experience with certainty and certainty with correctness. Harlan Osborne had not done that. 50 years of farming had taught Harlan the opposite lesson, that the ground was always more complicated than you thought it was, that what you knew this year was only part of what you needed to know, and that paying attention was not a temporary condition that ended when you became competent, but a permanent requirement of anyone who wanted to do real work in the real world. Chester had not known that he had forgotten this. You rarely do. You were right, Chester said, about April. Rupert was quiet for a moment. You weren't wrong about everything, Chester. You built something real. You just got to where you stopped checking whether the ground would hold. It was the most direct thing Rupert Radford had said to him in 12 years. Chester recognized it as such, recognized the courage it had taken to say it, and recognized further that the courage had come from the fact that they were both watching an old man who knew things no instrument had measured win a contest that all their expensive equipment had lost. From now on, Chester said, you bring me everything. The footnotes, the small things, everything. Rupert nodded once. Right. They walked together toward the case. Roy Tanner had arrived at some point during the extraction. Chester realized and was now standing outside the fence line with a notepad and a camera. Chester did not know exactly when the man had appeared or how much he had seen, but the notepad and the camera told him that whatever had happened here was not going to stay between the people who had witnessed it. He had known that on some level since the morning. A story this visible did not remain private. Roy Tanner was watching Harlan Osborne detach the chain from the case with the focused attention of someone who understood that the work of recording a moment was not the same as interrupting it. He had the patience of a man who had learned that the best information came to those who waited for it rather than demanding it. Roy had been a newspaper reporter for 25 years, and in that time he had covered floods and droughts and farm bankruptcies and the slow grinding decline of small Iowa towns and the occasional sudden violence of a bad season, meeting a family that had no reserves left. He was not a man who expected the world to offer him anything simple or clean, and mostly it did not. But standing at the fence line of that construction site and watching an old man on an iron platform from 1912 pull 60 tons of modern equipment out of a swamp, Roy had felt something that he rarely felt anymore in his line of work, which was the clear and uncomplicated sense that he was in the right place, watching the right thing, and that what he was seeing was genuinely, uncomplicatedly true. Not complicated by spin or context or the particular angle from which someone wanted the story told. Just true. Just a man and a machine doing something that needed to be done in the way it needed to be done, for reasons that went back further than any of the people watching could fully trace. Chester let him wait. He walked to where Harlan was working on the chain and stood there until the old man looked up. Mr. Osborne, he said, I owe you an apology. You owe me an accurate one, Harlan said. Not unkindly, precisely. Chester took a breath. I laughed at you. In front of my crew, I called your machine a museum piece. I treated you like someone wasting my time. You did. I was wrong. Harlan looked at him steadily for a moment. Then he said, you're not the first man to do that, and I don't expect you'll be the last. What I'm more interested in is whether you understand why it worked. He set a length of chain on the ground, not just today, in general. Chester looked at the 375 sitting on solid ground for the first time in 3 days, plastered with black mud, its cab and tracks and boom coated in the evidence of where it had been. The machine was worth $600,000. It would need cleaning and inspection before it could work again. But it was whole and it was out. "Tell me," Chester said. Harlan told him not the technical version, not the explanation about torque and rotational speed and steel cleats that he had given when the engineers were pushing back, but the other version, the one underneath the engineering, the one that his grandfather had understood before the terminology existed to describe it. "My grandfather said modern machines are built for speed," Harlan told him. "He said his steamer was built for work. The kind of work where going fast isn't possible, where the only question is whether you'll still be pulling when everything else has stopped." He paused. He was right about that. He understood something that the people with better equipment sometimes forget, which is that there's a difference between a machine being powerful and a machine being committed. Chester listened. He was not a man accustomed to listening in this particular way, to receiving rather than directing, but he stood still and he heard every word. "How much do I owe you?" he said when Harlan had finished. "A donation to the Clayton County Historical Society. They helped me restore this machine and they're trying to preserve what's left of the equipment that built this part of the country. Give them what you think 3 days of delays are worth in perspective." Chester did not hesitate. He took out his checkbook and wrote $10,000 to the Clayton County Historical Society and handed it to Harlan, who looked at it once and folded it into the pocket of his mud-covered work shirt. "One more thing," Chester said. "The survey footnote about consulting local landowners before deployment. I read it last night." Harlan said nothing. "Someone on my team flagged it and no one followed up. That's on me, not on the survey team and not on the people who wrote it down." Harlan picked up the chain and began recoiling it. "I know," he said. "I was one of the people your team talked to when they came through, back in the spring." He worked the chain link over link. The young man who came out to the property was polite. He wrote some things in his notebook. I don't know what happened to what he wrote. Chester knew what had happened to it. It had become a footnote on a page he had not read until 3 in the morning on the second night after his wife left it, where he would find it, because she understood things about how information moved through his organization that he had not permitted himself to understand. "I'm sorry for that too," Chester said. Harlan looked up from the chain. It was a different kind of look from the previous ones, not assessing, not guarded, something closer to acknowledgement, the recognition one man offers another when a thing has been said that deserved to be said. "All right," Harlan said. Roy Tanner was still outside the fence when Chester walked back toward his truck. The reporter had been watching the conversation from a distance, with the practiced discipline of someone who understood that proximity sometimes destroys the thing it is trying to observe. "Mr. Breckett," Roy said. "Roy Tanner, Des Moines Register. I'd like your comment on what happened here." "Print what you saw," Chester said. "I don't have anything to add to it. The machine, the man who drove it, the recovery itself. Is there anything you'd like people to know about Harlan Osborne?" Chester stopped walking. He stood with his hand on the door of his truck, and he thought for a moment about what he wanted to say, not what was strategic or protective or useful from a business standpoint, but what was simply true. "That man told my team about this swamp 6 months ago," Chester said. "We didn't listen. He waited until we had tried everything else, and then he came over and did in 3 minutes what 3 days of modern equipment couldn't do." He paused. "Print that, all of it." He got in his truck and drove away. Roy Tanner watched him go, then turned back toward the site where Harlan Osborne was completing the recoiling of the chain with Leland standing nearby, the younger man's camera hanging at his side. Roy crossed the fence line because the person who had told him to stay outside it had left, and he walked toward the father and son with his notepad open. Leland saw him coming. Harlan did not look up. "Mr. Osborne," Roy said when he reached them, "I'm Roy Tanner from the Register. Your son said you might be willing to talk." "I said he might be willing if it worked," Leland said. He looked at Roy with an expression that was not unfriendly, but was clear about its conditions. "It worked," Roy said. Harlan finished securing the last of the chain and stood up straight and looked at Roy Tanner with the calm assessment of a man who has nothing particular to hide and nothing particular to perform. "What do you want to know?" Harlan said. Roy asked about the machine. He asked about where it came from and how long it had been in the family and what it had taken to restore it. He asked Harlan to explain in terms a general reader could follow why it had succeeded where everything else had failed. Harlan explained it in 2 sentences, and Roy wrote them down exactly because 2 sentences was the right length for the thing Harlan was describing, and he had the journalist's instinct to recognize when a subject had given him the precise amount of language a story needed and not to ask for more. Then Roy asked the question that was underneath all the other questions. "Did you know it would work?" Harlan was quiet for a moment. He looked at the case, which was standing on solid ground in the September afternoon light, the boiler beginning to cool steam, no longer venting from the side valve, the brass fitting still catching the sun. "I knew what this machine can do," Harlan said. "I've known it for 40 years. Today was the first time I had a reason to show someone else." Roy wrote that down too. Then he asked if he could photograph the machine, and Harlan said yes, and Leland raised his own camera at the same moment, and for a few minutes the two of them moved around the case from different angles, the journalist and the son, each recording the same thing for different reasons. When Roy was done, he closed his notepad and extended his hand to Harlan, who shook it once firmly without ceremony. "Thank you," Roy said. "This is going to be a story people remember." Harlan looked at him. "It's already a story people will remember," he said. "You're just going to be the one who writes it down." Roy Tanner drove back toward Des Moines thinking about that sentence for the first 50 miles. He would think about it again when he sat down to write the story 2 days later, and he would think about it again years afterward at a funeral in Clayton County on a September morning that felt very much like this one. Leland drove the John Deere home alongside the case, matching his father's pace on the county road, the two machines moving together through the late afternoon. At the top of the rise where Harlan had blown the whistle on the way in, Harlan blew it again. Not the same sound as the arrival, not the long declaratory cry of something announcing itself. A shorter sound this time, 2 notes almost conversational, the sound of something completing a task and acknowledging the fact without fanfare. Leland had his camera in his lap. He raised it and took a single photograph of his father's back, the old man sitting straight on the iron platform, the smoke from the stack bending south in the light wind, the shadow of the machine stretching long across the gravel road ahead of them. He did not know at that moment what the photograph would become. He did not know it would sit at the center of a museum display, or that it would be reproduced in 3 different publications, or that people who had never heard of Clayton County would look at it decades later and feel something they found difficult to name. He only knew that it was true, which was the only thing that mattered to him about a photograph, and that his father was the subject, which was the only reason he had brought the camera in the first place. They reached the farm as the sun was dropping toward the western tree line. Harlan brought the case into the shed and shut down the boiler. In the careful sequence the machine required, releasing pressure in stages, checking each valve, working through the shutdown the way he had worked through the startup, without hurrying, without skipping steps. When he was done, he stood inside the shed for a moment in the quiet. The tarpaulin that he had pulled back that morning was folded on the workbench to his right. He did not replace it. The machine had earned a night without it. On the wall beside the shed door, in a wooden frame that had been there since 1984, was the last page of his grandfather's journal. Leland read it every time he walked through that door. Harlan had memorized it decades ago and did not need to read it anymore, but he glanced at it now out of habit, the way a man glances at something he loves. The handwriting was unsteady, the letters of a man in his last years, but the words were certain. Do not let them take it away. There will come a day when it is needed again. Harlan turned off the shed light and walked toward the house. The evening was cooling, and the first stars were appearing above the eastern fields, and somewhere in the distance, a dog was barking at something it had scented in the dark. Tomorrow, the phone would begin to ring. He did not know that yet. He only knew that the machine had done what it was built to do, and that his grandfather had been right, and that sometimes being right is a thing that takes 80 years to prove. He went inside, the light in the kitchen came on. The story ran on Thursday. Roy Tanner had written it in 2 sittings, which was unusual for him. Most pieces he wrote in pieces sections drafted at different hours, assembled and reassembled, until the structure felt earned. This one came out differently. He sat down on Tuesday evening with his notes and the photographs Leland Osborne had agreed to share, and he wrote for 4 hours without stopping. And when he read it back, he changed 11 words and left everything else alone. The headline was simple. A 1912 steam engine did what $600,000 of modern equipment could not. The photograph that ran with it was one of Leland's, the one taken from slightly behind and to the left of the case as it pulled the chain taut, the swamp visible in the background, the 375 emerging from the mud, Harlan Osborne's back straight on the platform, smoke rising from the stack against the flat Iowa sky. There was nothing staged about it. That was what made it work, made it. By Friday morning, the Des Moines Register had received more letters about a single story than it had received in 4 years. By Saturday, 2 television stations had called Roy asking for Harlan Osborne's contact information. By the following Wednesday, the story had been reprinted in 11 newspapers across the Midwest, and a clipping service had identified mentions in publications in Ohio, Minnesota, and as far east as Pennsylvania. Harlan read the article once on Thursday morning at the kitchen table with his coffee. Then he folded it and set it beside the stack of mail and did not read it again. He had lived through enough harvests to know that attention like weather was a condition to be worked around rather than a condition to be enjoyed. The telephone was another matter. It began ringing Friday morning at 7:40 and did not stop. Leland kept a legal pad beside the phone and wrote down every caller's name and number and the nature of their situation. Logging company in Winnebago County, a feller buncher stuck in creek bottom. Grain farmer outside Dubuque combined settled into a wet corner of a field he had not properly assessed after 3 weeks of rain. A documentary filmmaker from Chicago who wanted to know about rights and availability and whether Harlan had representation. Harlan told Leland to call back the logging company and the grain farmer. He told Leland to tell the filmmaker that the machine was not available for filming. Leland wrote it all down and made the calls and reported back, and in this way, a system established itself, not planned, not formalized, simply the practical response of 2 people who understood each other's priorities. Harlan decided which calls deserved a response. Leland managed everything else. The first rescue after the Register story was the logging company in Winnebago County, a feller buncher that had broken through the bank of a drainage ditch and settled at a 40-degree angle into the creek bed. The machine's operator had been trying to limb trees on the far side of the ditch and had misjudged the bank's stability after 2 weeks of dry weather, a familiar error. Harlan drove the case to the site on a flatbed that a neighboring farmer with a trailer lent him for the day, unloaded it in the parking area of the logging operation, and spent 20 minutes walking the creek bank before he said anything to anyone. The operations manager, a man named Kowalski, who was not related to the Bill Kowalski at the agricultural office, watched Harlan walk the bank with an expression that was not quite skeptical and not quite convinced, the expression of a man who had read a newspaper story and made a phone call on the basis of it and was now standing in the actual situation, recalibrating whether that had been a reasonable decision. "You want to tell me what you're looking for?" Kowalski asked. "Finding out where the bottom is," Harlan said without looking up from the bank. "And where it isn't." He walked another 100 feet downstream, crouched down and pressed his palm flat against the earth, held it there for a moment, then stood and came back. "I'll set up on this side," he said. "Angle of pull needs to be north by northeast, not straight back the way you'd think. There's solid shelf about 8 feet down on the north wall of the ditch. The chain needs to work against that, not against the soft bank." Kowalski looked at the ditch and at the angle Harlan was describing and did not argue, because he did not have a competing analysis and because something about the way Harlan had pressed his palm to the earth, the unhurried certainty of it, suggested a kind of knowledge that did not require defense. The feller buncher came out in 11 minutes. The angle of pull was exactly as Harlan had specified. Kowalski stood beside Leland afterward and watched Harlan recoil the chain. Leland had his camera but had not taken many photographs on this job. This was not for a newspaper. This was just work. "He always liked that?" Kowalski asked. "Quiet, certain." "Always," Leland said. "Must be something to be that sure of yourself." Leland considered the question. "I don't think it's himself he's sure of," he said. "I think it's the machine." There was a difference, and Leland understood. It had understood it since boyhood, had watched his father make that distinction in the way he talked about the case and the way he never talked about himself. Harlan Osborne was not a confident man in the ordinary sense. He was a man who trusted completely in something outside himself, something that had been tested across decades and had not failed, and that trust had a quality of stillness to it that other people read as confidence because they had no better category for it. Over the next 5 years, Harlan and Leland and the case extracted 11 pieces of equipment from situations that other methods had failed to resolve. They developed a rhythm, the two of them, a division of labor that was never discussed but was always understood. Harlan assessed, Leland prepared, Harlan operated, Leland documented. The chain came out and went back in. The whistle blew when the job was done. The donation to the Clayton County Historical Society was arranged whatever amount the rescued party could honestly afford. The largest donation in those years came from a road construction company whose cement mixer had tipped into a ditch on a county highway project, and whose insurance company had been unable to resolve the situation for 9 days before someone suggested calling Harlan Osborne. Pete Garland was the engineer on that cement mixer job, a methodical man of 40 who had spent his career in civil construction and who had driven to the site that morning with the explicit intention of finding a technical reason to decline the old farmer's services before they were wasted on a situation that he had already analyzed and found to require more conventional intervention. He did not find the technical reason he was looking for because Harlan arrived before Pete could complete his analysis and walk the ditch for 15 minutes, and then position the case with a specificity that Pete could not immediately account for within his existing framework. "You're pulling at the wrong angle," Pete said. Harlan adjusted the position of the case by 6 feet and did not respond. "The load path should run parallel to the road surface, not oblique to it. That's basic extraction geometry." Harlan looked at Pete Garland with an expression that was not unfriendly. "The road surface isn't where the resistance is. The resistance is in the north corner of the ditch where the machine is wedged against the original stone base. I need to pull it clear of that before I pull it up. Oblique first, then parallel." Pete started to say something further and then stopped because What Harlan had described was actually correct, and he could see that it was correct now that it had been pointed out, and the fact that he had not seen it himself despite standing at this ditch for 2 days was information he needed to sit with. The mixer came out in 8 minutes. Pete Garland drove away from that job site with a particular kind of discomfort that he recognized after reflection as the productive kind. The kind that meant he had been shown something true that contradicted something he had assumed. He had built his career on the principle that formal training and systematic method produced the best outcomes in construction, in engineering, and this was still true in the majority of cases. But the old farmer at the ditch had shown him something that his training had not covered, a way of reading a physical situation that came from a different source than methodology, something slower and older, and in its own domain, just as reliable. He made a donation that was larger than his project budget authorized, and he paid the difference himself. He also, 3 months later, sent a check for $15,000 to the Clayton County Historical Society on behalf of his firm with a note that said simply, "For things worth preserving." He signed it not with his name, but with the name of the project, County Road, 22 October 1994, because he thought the society would understand what the project had taught the man who ran it. They did. By 1997, the society had enough money to build a real building, not a repurposed barn or a converted equipment shed, an actual museum, timber-framed and insulated, and lit properly with display cases and archival storage, and a room large enough to host school groups. The woman who ran the society was named Margaret Forsyth, a retired history teacher of 65 who had the patience of someone accustomed to working with adolescents and the precision of someone who had spent 30 years trying to make them understand that the past was not a collection of dates but a record of decisions. She called Harlan in the spring of 1997 and asked him to come to a meeting about the new building. He came and sat and listened to the plans, and when Margaret described what she envisioned as the centerpiece of the main exhibition space, he said quietly and without apology that the machine would not be staying. Margaret set down her pen. "Mr. Osborne, the historical significance of that engine, particularly given everything that's happened in the last 5 years, is considerable. The society believes it deserves a permanent home where people can see it and understand what it represents." "It represents a working machine," Harlan said. "Machines that stop working stop representing anything. We would maintain it, of course. It needs to be used, not maintained. There's a difference." He looked at Margaret across the table with the directness she had come to expect from him. "You can have the story, the photographs, the journal pages, the documentation of everything it's done. You can build whatever display you want around those things. I'll bring the machine to your opening and to events when you need it, but it goes home after." Margaret considered this for a long moment. She was not a woman who accepted compromise without understanding exactly what she was accepting. "The display will say it's a working machine," she said. "Still operational, still used. That's the truth. Then we have an agreement." Harlan wrote the text for the plaque himself on a yellow legal pad in the same kitchen where he had read Roy Tanner's article 4 years earlier. He wrote several versions and crossed out all but one. The final version said Case Steam Traction Engine 1912, Osborne Family, Clayton County, built before the First World War, still working. Some things do not become obsolete. They wait for people to remember why they were made. Margaret corrected 2 spelling errors and had it cast in bronze. The museum opened in September of 1997, 5 years to the month after the swamp rescue. Harlan drove the case to the opening ceremony along the same county road he had driven it in 1992, at the same speed with Leland, alongside on the John Deere. The crowd that had gathered for the opening heard the whistle before they saw the machine, and those who were old enough felt something move in them that they could not have named precisely, but that had to do with recognition, with the particular emotion of encountering something from the deep past that has refused to die. The autumn after the swamp rescue, Chester Beckett spent 3 evenings at the kitchen table with Catherine, working through the language of a new company policy. He was not a man who wrote policies easily. He was a man who made decisions and expected them to be carried out, which was a different thing. And the gap between those two approaches was part of what had landed the 375 in the swamp in the first place. Catherine sat across the table with her red pen and marked the places where the language was vague or the requirements could be misread, and he revised and she marked again, and by the third evening they had something that said what it needed to say. The policy required a written community consultation report for any heavy equipment deployment on terrain that had not been previously used by Beckett Construction. It specified that the consultation had to include interviews with landowners and longtime residents within a half-mile radius of the deployment zone, that the results had to be documented in writing, and that the documentation had to be reviewed and signed by the chief engineer before any equipment was moved into position. Rupert Radford helped Chester add the technical language. Chester kept the plain language himself. He did not announce the policy to his team as a response to the swamp incident. He announced it as a new standard of practice, effective immediately, no further explanation given. Most of his engineers assumed he had heard about a lawsuit somewhere and was being cautious. That was fine. The reason mattered less than the result. Chester Beckett was at the opening. He had driven up from the office where Beckett Construction still operated under his name, with Rupert Radford still as chief engineer, in a policy formally written into the project intake process that required a community consultation report before any heavy equipment deployment in previously unstudied terrain. Chester had written the policy himself in the fall of 1992 and had explained it to Rupert in terms that did not require much elaboration. He shook Harlan's hand at the opening and said very little because he had said what he needed to say 5 years earlier in a field outside a swamp, and he was not a man who repeated himself when the original statement had been adequate. But he stayed for the entire ceremony, and he stood in front of the bronze plaque for a while after the crowd had moved on to other displays reading the words that Harlan had written. Then September of 2001 arrived. Harlan Osborne died on a Wednesday morning, sitting on the porch of the farmhouse where he had spent his entire life, a cup of coffee cooling in his hand. The morning was clear and warm, the sky the same shade of blue that September reliably produced over Clayton County, the corn standing at its full height in the fields on 3 sides of the property. Leland found him there at 8:30 and sat down in the chair beside him before he called anyone. He sat for a while and looked in the direction his father was facing, which was the direction of the equipment, shed the door open as Harlan had left it when he went out to check the machine's pressure fittings earlier that morning, a task he performed on the first Wednesday of every month, regardless of weather or schedule. The case was visible in the shed's dim interior, the brass fittings catching a thin line of morning light from the open door. Leland sat with his father for several minutes in the September morning, and then he went inside and made the calls that needed to be made. The funeral was the largest that Clayton County had seen in at least 2 decades. People came from Dubuque and Des Moines and from small towns across eastern Iowa, people who had known Harlan directly and people who had only known his name from a newspaper article or a television segment or a story someone had told them about a machine that should have been obsolete and wasn't. Chester Beckett came older and slower but present and stood near the front and told the story of the swamp to anyone who would listen, not because they had not heard it, but because he needed to tell it, because telling it was the closest thing to a debt repayment that language could provide. Roy Tanner came without his note. Notepad. He had made that decision in the car on the way up, deliberate and firm, a conscious choice to be present rather than recording. He stood in the back of the church and watched people he had never met grieve for a man they had loved, and he thought about the sentence Harlan had said to him in the field 9 years earlier. It is already a story people will remember. You are just going to be the one who writes it down. After the service in the yard of the church where people had gathered in the September warmth, Catherine Breckett found Leland Osborne standing slightly apart from the main crowd holding a cup of coffee he had not drunk. I wanted to find you, she said, because I wanted to say something that Chester should probably say himself but won't, because he's over there telling the swamp story again, and he won't stop until someone interrupts him. Leland looked at her. He had met her once before briefly at the museum opening and had remembered her as a woman who said exactly what she meant without announcement. Your father changed my husband, Catherine said. Not the rescue, not the machine, your father. The way he carried himself, the way he listened before he spoke, the way he knew the difference between being certain of yourself and being certain of what you know. She paused. Chester started asking questions he hadn't asked before. Started reading the footnotes. Started calling Rupert on Saturday mornings to go over things he'd missed during the week. She looked across the yard to where Chester was standing with a group of men talking with his hands the way he talked when the subject was important. He would not have done any of that if Harlan hadn't shown him what it looked like. Leland was quiet for a moment. My father never tried to teach anyone anything, he said. He just did the work. I know, Catherine said. That's why it worked. She went back to her husband. Leland watched her go, then looked down at the coffee in his hands, which had gone cold. He set it on the wall beside him and walked to his truck, because there was something he needed to do before the afternoon was gone. He drove home to the farm and walked to the equipment shed and stood inside it for a while in the quiet. The case stood where it always stood. The tarpaulin was folded on the workbench, had been folded there since the morning of September 8, 1992. The morning Harlan had pulled it back for the first time in years and left it folded rather than replace it. In 9 years, he had never put it back. The machine did not need covering. The machine was not something you put away. On the wall beside the door in its wooden frame was the last page of Wendell Osborne's journal. Leland read it in the fading afternoon light, not because he needed to read it, he knew every word, but because the act of reading it was a different thing than knowing it, the way that returning to a place is different from remembering it. He built a fire in the boiler with hands that had learned the process from watching his father, and from doing it alongside him, and from doing it alone in the years since Harlan had trusted him to do it without supervision. The sequence was fixed, and he did not deviate from it. This was not reverence exactly, though it was not without reverence. It was precision. The machine required precision, and precision was what it received. The pressure climbed. Leland watched the gauge reading it the way his father had taught him to read it, not just the number but the rate of change, the steadiness of the climb, the small signals that told him whether everything inside was working as it should. When the pressure reached operating level, he opened the throttle and let the drive wheels turn slowly in the shed, the cleats pressing against the packed earth floor, the machine breathing its deep rhythmic breath in the enclosed space. Then he reached for the whistle valve and pulled it once. The sound went out from the shed and across the farmyard and into the September evening, and it carried across the flat fields and the county road and the distance beyond. And Roy Tanner, who was driving south on Highway 52 toward Des Moines after the funeral, heard it through his closed car window at a distance he later estimated at 3 miles. He pulled to the shoulder of the highway and turned off his radio and sat still until the sound was gone. Then he sat for a while longer in the silence that followed it, because the silence after that sound had a particular quality, not emptiness, but completion, the way a sentence feels after its last word. He drove home and wrote nothing that night. Some things did not need to be written down. Some things were already stored in a place that writing could not improve. The years that followed were quieter in some ways and louder in others. Leland took over the farm and the machine and the phone calls, handling the calls in his own way, shorter on patience for preamble than his father had been, but equally committed to the work itself. He did not advertise. He did not have a rate card. He had a chain and a boiler and the accumulated knowledge of 3 generations stored in a machine that expressed it through action rather than language. In 2008, he received a call from a construction company in Wisconsin, 200 miles north, a job too far to transport the case efficiently. He almost said no. He had always thought of the work as inseparable from the machine, the two things so linked in his mind that one without the other seemed like only half of what was needed. But the man on the phone had heard about Harlan Osborne from someone who had worked on the County Road 22 job years before, and something about the description he gave of the situation, a dozer buried in a drainage basin with a specific kind of clay composition, made Leland think that he understood the problem, even from 200 miles away. He drove up without the machine and walked the site for 2 hours, moving the way his father had taught him to move in these situations, slowly and without agenda, letting the ground tell him what it knew before he decided what to do about it. The engineering team followed him at a respectful distance and did not ask questions while he was walking. One of them started to explain this situation, and Leland raised one hand not unkindly, and the man stopped. There was information available here that language would only contaminate. When Leland finished walking, he told the engineering team 3 things they had not tried: the angle of approach for their recovery vehicle, the sequence in which to release pressure rather than applying force, and one point on the near bank where the ground was solid enough to anchor a winch without driving a concrete footing, which would save them half a day of setup. The excavator came out the following morning without the case being present at all. Leland drove home, and when the company called to ask what they owed him, he told them to send whatever they thought was fair to the Clayton County Historical Society. He had understood something that day that he had been moving toward for years, something his father had never needed to articulate because he had known it without language. The machine was the instrument, but the knowledge was the thing. The knowledge could travel further than the machine. The knowledge could solve problems the machine could not reach. 23 years after the swamp rescue in September of 2015, Leland received a call from a job site in Clayton County. The voice on the phone was young, mid-20s at most, and it had the careful tone of someone who had been told to make a call he was not entirely sure was a good idea. "Mr. Osborne," the voice said, "my name is Farrell Brackett. I think you knew my grandfather." Leland had been expecting this call in some form for years. Not from this particular person, but from someone like him, the next iteration of a pattern that seemed to want to repeat. "I know who you are," Leland said. "Where are you?" Farrell Brackett was standing at the edge of the same north corridor of the old Highway 52 project, looking at a Caterpillar 395 that had broken through a surface crust 2 hours earlier and settled into the black mud of a swamp that had not changed in any meaningful way since 1992. The 395 was larger than the 375 had been. It had more technology, better sensors, a more sophisticated operator interface, and a manufacturer's warranty that covered nearly every failure mode the engineers had anticipated. It had not anticipated this particular failure mode because this failure mode had been anticipated by an old farmer in 1992 who had passed his knowledge to his son, who was now driving the family's steam traction engine down a county road toward the same swamp for the second time in his life. Farrell Brackett watched Leland arrive from the cab of his pickup and felt the collision of disbelief and something else. Something that did not have a clean name, but that involved the recognition that his grandfather had been right about this specific thing and that he, Farrell, had been given the information and had not used it. Chester had warned him, not in abstract terms, not as general wisdom, but specifically this swamp, this corridor, this family's machine. Chester had told the story of the 1992 rescue to Farrell at least a dozen times over the years, and Farrell had listened the way young people listen to old stories, respectful on the surface, and privately certain that the conditions that had produced the story no longer applied. They applied. Leland set up the case without ceremony, walking the swamp edge first, reading the ground the way his father had taught him, finding with his feet the information that instruments could not provide. Farrell watched him and did not speak because something about the silence Leland maintained while he worked made speech feel inappropriate. "Your grandfather warned you," Leland said when he had finished his assessment and was positioning the machine. "It was not a question. He told me this was the only spot in eastern Iowa where his family's machine was the right answer," Farrell said. "I thought that was nostalgia." Leland looked at him. "It was memory," he said. "There's a difference. The 395 weighed 70 tons, 10 more than the 375 had weighed in 1992. The case was 103 years old." Leland opened the throttle and the drive wheels began to turn, and the chain went taut with the same patience it had always had. The patience that did not require belief or confidence or certainty, only the continued application of force in the right direction at the right rate. 6 minutes later, the 395 was on solid ground. Farrell Brackett stood beside the machine afterward and looked at it for a long time. He was trying to locate words for something he had not expected to feel, something that went beyond gratitude or relief, something that had to do with the particular sensation of discovering that the world contains knowledge older than yourself that has been preserved for your benefit by people who did not know you were coming. "My grandfather wrote something in his will," Farrell said finally. "He left the company to my father and then to me, but there was a letter with it, one paragraph." He stopped. He said the most important thing he ever learned in business was that being certain you're right is not the same as being willing to find out you're wrong. He said a man named Harlan Osborne showed him that. Leland did not respond immediately. He was coiling the chain link over link, the same motion his father had performed after every job, methodical and unhurried. "He also left a standing instruction," Farrell said. "In the letter, he said that if Brackett Construction ever worked in this corridor again, we were required to contact the Osborne family before beginning. He wrote it as a company policy." Farrell paused. "I found the policy in the files. I didn't think it still applied. And now I understand why he wrote it." Leland finished coiling the chain and stood up. He looked at Farrell Brackett, 28 years old, standing in the September light in a field his grandfather had stood in 23 years earlier. And he saw clearly the thing that the story kept insisting on, the thing that resisted the easy comfort of calling it coincidence or irony. It was not a coincidence. It was not irony. It was a pattern, and patterns meant that something was trying to be understood, and the claim of the people who recognized the pattern was to help the next person understand it before the swamp did. "Your grandfather was a proud man," Leland said. "He had a reason to be. He built something real." He looked out across the corridor toward the tree line where the old oaks still stood, the same oaks his father had driven past in 1992. Pride is not the problem. The problem is when pride makes you stop listening. Your grandfather stopped and then started again. That's the harder thing. Farrell was quiet for a moment. "What do I owe you?" "What your grandfather started," Leland said. 10,000 to the Historical Society. Whatever you can add to that on top." Farrell transferred the funds on his phone before Leland had finished loading the case for transport. He did it the way Chester had written the original check, without hesitation, because hesitation in that moment would have been a kind of argument, and there was nothing left to argue about. When Leland drove home that evening, he took the long way, the route that went past the museum. He did not stop. The building was closed at that hour, the parking lot empty, the lights off inside. But he could see through the front window the illuminated display in the main room, the photographs in the journal pages, and the bronze plaque on its stand lit by the small internal lights that ran on a timer and stayed on after closing so that the things inside would not be entirely in the dark. He drove on. At the farm, he put the case back in its place in the shed and went through the shutdown sequence and checked each fitting. He replaced nothing that did not need replacing. He adjusted one valve that had developed a slight imprecision in its seating, a task that took 11 minutes and required a tool his father had made from a piece of bar stock and a wooden handle, a tool that existed nowhere else in the world, and that Leland had learned to use at the age of 14. Before he left the shed, he looked at the page in the wooden frame. Wendell Osborne's handwriting, the uncertain cursive of an old man writing words he needed to last. He had read those words hundreds of times since childhood. He had read them after his father died and in the years between and tonight. He turned off the light and walked to the farmhouse, and the September dark settled over the shed, and the machine inside it and the brass fittings cooled in the darkness, and somewhere above the flat Iowa landscape, the stars were coming out, the same stars that had been there in 1912 when Wendell Osborne drove a new machine home from Racine and parked it in a shed and believed it would be needed again. He had been right. He had been right in a way that crossed 3 generations and outlasted everyone who had doubted him, and the proof of it sat in a shed in Clayton County and would sit there through the winter and into the spring, waiting with the patience that had always been its defining quality, the patience of something that understood at a level deeper than understanding that its work was not finished. The whistle would blow again. It always did. And when it did, it would carry across the flat Iowa farmland the way it always had, not announcing itself, not asking permission, simply declaring that it was still here, still working, still equal to whatever the day required. That was enough. It had always been enough.